So, will China remain the factory of the world? Or is this the end of this factory of the world? And are we going to diversify and decouple from China, primarily triggered by things like the pandemic, the energy crisis, of course the war in Ukraine, but many other things like inflation. And so we have to figure out how to deal with that future. Can we still be dependent on China for our own future outside of China? That's the answer I'm going to try and give in today's Pascal's China Lens. Now, last week I missed a beat, so I didn't post anything last week simply because I had my book launch on my new book called Can We Trust China? So if you're interested, it's translated in English. It will be available by the end of this month, April. And so that means that I can share all my thoughts within one book. I hope you will like it if you buy it. Now, if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, do so now. I would really appreciate it. Lots of videos, and I'm going to continue. I'm also going to put a lot of videos about my book, chapters on my books and topics of my book in the next months to come. Will China remain the factory of the world? Considering what we're seeing today, with everything happening in Russia, with the war in Ukraine, a lot of people are asking, is this the beginning of a deglobalization, the beginning of the end of globalization for Russia for sure, but how about China? Will they be next? And so if you just look at the factory of the world today, which is China, then what you see is that 125 countries globally, that's 3 out of 4 countries in the world, have China as biggest trading partner. What you also see is that 20 years ago, 80% of the world's countries were having America as biggest trading partner or bigger trading partner than China. Today is the reverse. China is doing about $6 trillion every year purely in trade. That is about 30% of their GDP, and if you look purely at exports, it's about 17% of exports of the GDP that is just made out of exports. So a big bunch of their revenue, of their GDP, is just exporting. And so China has become the factory of the world. So what will the future entail? Well, if you look at the globalization trend, which is important to see, what you see is that for a while we've had what we call a slowbalization or a deglobalization since 2008. But if you go back in history, it's quite interesting to see why we had a globalization. If you go back before the First World War, it was very clear the globalization was because of steam engines, and so things could be shipped more easily, and so that was the reason that it went global or more global. But then it stopped during the 2 wars. Between the First and the Second World War, what we saw is again the slowbalization or the globalization that was actually slowing down. And so why did this happen? And I think it's interesting to go back 100 years to understand what were the triggers. The triggers were the Spanish flu. It was about Russia not being part of the world trade anymore after the First World War. It was also a lot to do with the Great Depression in 2029 and protectionism of many countries back then. And so, doesn't this sound familiar? Isn't this exactly what's happening today? A pandemic, a depression, or maybe inflation, recession, things like this Russia being not part of the world trade anymore, and protectionism everywhere. I mean, it's like a copy-paste of it. And so what we saw after the Second World War is a globalization, and that was led primarily by America, that was responsible for keeping most of the world at peace, and because of that, more and more countries could actually join this world trade. Specifically in the 80s and the 90s, China and India started being part of it, and then in 2001, when China joined the WTO, I mean, they became the factory of the world. And so you could see this grow very fast in the 80s and the 90s, but specifically it stopped in 2008. And that was also to do with the production levels in China that actually were growing but suddenly went down as well. But it had also to do with supply chains globally that were restructured and reforming and didn't get set up everywhere anymore. But what really changed it and accelerated it were a few points later. 2015 was the first one where Xi Jinping said the Made in China 2025 plan, and that meant that basically basically by 2025, China would have most of its industry become self-dependent and not dependent on the imports of the world, because they understood, because of their production levels, that they would be dependent on the high tech, dependent on things they needed, and that's vulnerable for a country like China. And so they started creating this actually deglobalization themselves. So a lot of the decoupling started in China in 2015, just by having this plan of 2025. But then, of course, Trump, a year or two later, when he got elected, and even before the election, he started talking about America first. And this was all about, we need to get these jobs back. We need to get these factories back. We sent everything to the cheaper countries to produce them, in Asia, in Africa, in Mexico, everywhere. But now we need to get them back to the US. And that set that trend, that accelerated the trend of deglobalization, where many countries, even Apple, were considering, should we go back to the US because politically it's not correct anymore. Now, of course, if you look today, what you see very clearly is that we're going slowly into a bipolar world. Russia has created this new world, which was already naturally being created since 2015, into two parts. There's like the West in green on this chart, or on the world map, where you see the West, including Australia and Japan and some other countries, which are really forming one big block. And then there's everything in gray, and that's where most of the factories and most of the produce is being done for the richer countries. And so this has been accelerated. And so currently you see that the trend is actually to decouple. So what's clear is that decoupling and the deglobalization is just a fact. And Russia might never be part of this globalized world anymore. And if they are part, they're probably going to be part of the gray world on itself, or the new world in the southern hemisphere. And so this is really what's happening. But what we also saw happening is that on a short term, just today, we are in a crisis. Many crises we had in the past years, which is creating for that deglobalization as well. COVID, of course, logistics, a lot of things were stopped or blocked, and customs were actually in trouble, but not just customs didn't let the goods pass anymore. We saw many factories being closed. So what we saw is that the whole world was actually in crisis and also being shaken, so that we couldn't get the production or the products to the consumers in time anymore. We of course had an energy crisis, and that we saw even before the war in Ukraine, that suddenly, because of renewables and the climate goals, we had to change all our parameters and priorities, and suddenly everybody was grabbing for energy, and this became a different war in itself, with as a result that some people had really challenges on energy and everything became more expensive. And so this is a disruption in itself. Now, just a month ago when the war in Ukraine started, it was very clear that this is here to stay, and that suddenly we are very concerned but also aware of the dependency that we have on certain countries like Ukraine and Russia. If you think about food, you think about oil, you think about resources, materials, raw materials, you think about things like energy, oil and gas. I mean, today it's a big issue. It's such a big issue that we feel that even in Europe we have to choose between eat and heat. I mean, how are we going to cope with that? And so we have become too dependent on certain countries. And so one of the things that happened in the past weeks is these sanctions on Russia, which created specifically the ban out of SWIFT, so they couldn't use the international payment system anymore, which has created alternative payment systems in the world. And you see things reshuffling, but you also see that we're trying to actually decouple from some regimes or to authoritarian regimes. And so China, with this factory, might be the next one. And then, of course, you have the inflation, where we also feel that because of COVID, because of energy problems, because of lots of issues in the West, we have to pay a lot more money and get a lot less. And so this is a real inflation problem. Could become a recession. It means we've been printing and spending money, but now we're getting the headache afterwards. And specifically with this war, how are we going to deal with that? So all these things and many more create a situation that we feel in the West we have to somehow decouple from being dependent on the factory of China. Now, what we saw in the last years is that a lot of countries, a lot of companies started to diversify. They started to diversify their supply chains. If you look at America, it's very clear that many of the CFOs, so the financial officers of the American companies, have decided that they should actually produce more or buy more, source more from American companies, from global companies, not just from China. China would go down with almost 30%. And so that is actually something that people are considering. And then others still want to source more from China, but on average it's like a 20% decrease if you would believe the CFOs of big American companies. Now what's also happening is that we have an evolution in 3D printing. I mean, this is early days, of course, but some of the factories say, well, we don't need to print it or build it anymore in China or other places. Everything is getting robotized, automated. We can do everything in-house or closer by, or maybe friendly countries just across the border in Eastern Europe or wherever we want them. And so we are diversifying. That's just a fact. What you also see is that the world is becoming a political minefield. And so it's becoming very difficult to know, should we actually rely, can we rely on products coming from certain regimes, certain countries that could suddenly block it? I mean, the European Commission with Ursula von der Leyen said very clearly just last week on the 1st of April that Lithuania, for example, is getting blocked by China to receive certain products. Of course, China is saying this is not true, but it is becoming a political battlefield, like using economics to block certain countries to do things that, or if they don't do things that you want them to do, you will actually hurt them. Now, I'm not saying China is doing this only, I mean every country is doing this, but it is becoming a minefield, and so diversification is needed for most of the Western countries. But then if you look at the Southern Hemisphere, the rest of the world, not the West, what you see is that there's also a diversification happening, but in the reverse direction. Well, the Belt and Road, you can clearly see that more and more countries are starting to trade with China and link itself and becoming more dependent on China. And this is not just because they don't want to be dependent on the West, but in one way, it's just about not putting all your eggs in that same basket. And so China is benefiting from some of these products and some of these investments that otherwise other countries are saying, this is not something we're doing anymore, or want to do, or have time or money for. And so everything is starting to diversify. But the big change could happen in the currencies. What that means is that you see, since the war started a month ago, that more and more countries, Saudi Arabia, you're seeing India, you're seeing a lot of countries in Africa starting to consider to actually using the Chinese currency or the yuan or renminbi as an exchange, as a reserve currency. And this is something we've never seen before, because it was always the US dollars, the euro, the yen that were the reserve currencies, because they're politically stable. I mean, it's a different regime, and so you can actually also exchange it, because you can't just exchange the Chinese yuan. So there's reasons enough not to go and buy Chinese currency as an exchange, as a reserve currency. But for countries that are trading a lot with China, and you know that's 125 countries trading more with China than any other country, I mean, having the Chinese yuan as an exchange currency is actually an insurance towards the future. Specifically for those countries that feel that it's very politically sensitive and that they could suddenly actually be sanctioned as well. And many of these countries in the Belt and Road have kind of not always a friendly attitude, specifically when it comes to the United States. I mean, some do, but many don't. And so they are looking at China more as an insurance policy. What that means is that the Chinese currency could suddenly become more important as a reserve currency, could also become more open on the exchange market, and so tradable, and that means that this is going to change the whole parameters of this whole deglobalization, because suddenly it's like two worlds, and that means a very different thing for the world. Now, the supply chain in itself is really a disruption that is costing so much money, but also customers are actually getting disappointed about it. And there's a lot of things related to the capacity that's sometimes in excess, sometimes too little. And so we need to diversify the whole world. I mean, there's no other option. The question is, will this hurt the factory of the world? Will this hurt China? And so if you look at the factory of the world, which is China, 10, 20, 30 years ago, what you saw is that hundreds of millions of people went to these factories to build these products that we love so much, in the West specifically. And they didn't build this for us, they built it for themselves, and they got their country richer, they got the people richer, and now half of the population is living in the middle class almost. And so the factory of China created that economy for China, the superpower that China now is. But the question we're never asking ourselves is, why is China the factory of the world? We're assuming that it's the factory of the world because there's lots of people that 20, 30 years ago wanted to work at very low prices and want to work really hard. And because of that, we just went to China because it was cheaper. But the mistake we're making there is that if that would be the main reason, then why didn't India or Indonesia or Africa or South America or many other poor places in the world become the factory of the world? And I think it has to do with a number of things that China's really good at. And that will be hard to replicate. And that's something we need to think about. First of all, Chinese like to be the master, the expert in one domain. They want to be the best in their domain. And once they are the best, they just pass it along to the next one who wants to be the best as well. This is part of the educational system, part of the culture that is 2,500 years. And so that mastership is something many people in the West just don't care about anymore. It's not about being the best, it's just about having a good life and making sure that you fulfill all your dreams and whatever you want. But in China, it's a lot about showing that you are an expert. This is about reputation, it's about face. This is, of course, about trust. And so this is all what China has to offer, but it's also about their collective society. And what that means is that Chinese together, when they're in network, in relationships, people that they know each other, they really like to follow one leader or certain leaders that tell them where the direction is. And as long as this leader shows that everything is upward, they gladly follow and work really hard together towards one goal. Again, in production, this is very useful. But it's also the pragmatism of Chinese. I mean, Chinese are very practical people, and so they care about solving problems. And so this, of course, again, in factories is very useful. It's not about building the best stuff or the cheapest stuff. It's about just making sure it works and is actually affordable. And then the other advantage they have besides their pragmatism is that they think in quantity. And we have always in the West have laughed a little bit at China and say, yeah, I mean, we're the quality, they're the quantity. I mean, they don't care about quality. But that's not what it's about. It's just about a culture that has 1.4 billion people and that thinks in scale by default. And when you think in scale, because you have so many people, such a big market, and now they have the world as market, then you have economies of scale. And when you have economies of scale, you can actually lower the prices. And that is something that many of the other countries in the world just didn't think about. A country like where I'm from, Belgium, I mean, we were happy if we can export to Holland or to France or Germany. We never thought, or very few companies did, to immediately become a global company or basically have like billions of customers. No, we first want to have one customer, then two, then three, then four. And so we'll see how it goes. In China, they very quickly think in quantity. And so that's the big difference often with the West. And so replicating that is going to be extremely hard, although we think we have to because we want to decouple. Now, China also has some other assets which are quite unique, which will be extremely hard to replicate. One is the raw materials. If you think about raw materials, I mean, it's very clear that of the 30 biggest rare earths, as we call them, I mean, China has about 45% of all that into their control. I mean, that's half of all the rare earths that we really need for renewables, we need for defense, is all in the hands of China. And that is mainly in Africa, but it's also in places like in Asia, Tajikistan, it's in Kazakhstan, it's in Vietnam, it's in Russia, in Ukraine, in China, of course. And so you see that they have a lot of control on these raw materials, or rare earths, as we often call them. And so this is critical for our future as well. So how are we going to do that? Well, in Europe, they say, yeah, we're going to have a plan by 2025 to solve this. That means by 2030, we're going to be fully operational. So for the next 10 years, China has an advantage. The other thing is the talent pool, and we don't always think about that. But the reality is that China has an enormous talent pool, specifically in manufacturing. We've not been interested in the West, in America, in Europe, to actually train many of the people in many of the jobs that we didn't think made sense because it could be done somewhere else. And so the Chinese became experts, not just in pure assembly lines, but also in electronics, in the most complicated designs, to execute, assemble them, and actually produce them. And so we are not the experts anymore. And on top of that, more than 30% of all the engineers in the world, the STEM, like we say, science, technology, engineering, and math degrees, are coming out of China. And so 1 out of 3 people in the world with an engineering degree comes from China. And so in the smart factory of tomorrow, which it is now becoming, talent is crucial. But then it also has to do with the investment that China has made over the past decades. Specifically the last 10 years, seeing the investment they made in becoming that smart factory. This had everything to do with IoT, with cloud, with big data, with everything that is connected, and artificial intelligence, of course. And now they're moving into becoming the green factory. I mean, green products, green factories. It's all about green supply chain. We're seeing everything happening in both tech and green coming together in an ecosystem in China. And then there are investments, specifically when it's about factories, on data and robots. I mean, there's no country that has so much data as China. But it's not about the amount of data. It's the fact that all this data is connected. So from the customer up to the factory floor, that data just flows from one to the other automatically, which means that factories know exactly when to produce, how much to produce, and at what cost. And that is an enormous advantage. And I'm not saying the West doesn't have that, but they've opened these data flows and basically this whole environment of data. But on top of it, there's the robots. I mean, there's no country in the world that has so many robots today as China. And 1 out of 3 robots sold in the world are Chinese robots. On top of that, China has more industrial robots than the US, than Germany, than South Korea, and many countries together. So it's the top robot country in the world. Now they have to put them all at work, but that's just a matter of 1 or 2 or 3 years. And so what we're seeing is that China has all these resources that are going to take us, at least in the West, in America, in Europe, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years to replicate. And so, yes, China will remain the factory of the world very, very long. Now, the other thing has to do with their ecosystems. And the ecosystem in China is quite unique. I mean, when we look at production, supply chain, logistics, we look at all that. I mean, it's just amazing. But I think the thing we're not seeing very often is that China has a family relationship culture. And so many of these factories in China are run by families or run by friends. They're run by people relationships, people that know each other, that trust each other. And everybody has their own expertise. And when you go to Shenzhen and you want to get your cell phone repaired, you very quickly see, like, I mean, maybe the wife is doing the customer service, then the man is doing the R&D, and then basically there's a sales guy, that's the brother or the child, or I mean, there's a little child learning it all, and so they're all working together, and this makes them stick together. And this is an ecosystem on a small level, but then that same thing happens on larger scale. And this is how Chinese think in relationships. If you go to Shenzhen, you can really see how you can buy anything because all these factories are somehow connected. And this creates this ecosystem of supply chain and suppliers that is unseen in most places in the West. The other thing that's really cool about it is that the government is chipping in, specifically the local governments, the city governments. The city governments are building the infrastructure for these ecosystems. What that means is that they will get hubs, innovation hubs, they will get benefits, tax breaks, they will get lots of stuff. And then you see each of these cities competing with each other, with as a result that one city is an expert in that, another city is an expert in that, and so everybody has its own expertise. It may be production in textiles or production in chips or production in whatever it is. And so that means that China is becoming one big factory on itself because the local governments are supporting specifically the expertise that every region needs. And so this is quite unique. You don't see that in many other places, where often every government is just replicating what the other government is doing. Now, what the other thing is about the infrastructure. And to go into the smart factory of tomorrow, you need infrastructure. You need that basically connection, and that's of course 5G these days, but it's also about cloud, it's about connection everywhere, not just about data, it's also about logistics and the roads and the high-speed trains and the airplanes and the ships. And I mean, tell me one country that has invested so much in building out this whole infrastructure. I mean, it's amazing. And specifically, just to get the throughput through customs, getting the whole tax and VAT solved, getting everything checked, having smart contracts, all that is what the ecosystem is about. And so China, in my view, how I followed it the past years, have actually gone 3 to 4, maybe 5 years ahead of many places in the West, just to build that infrastructure to provide these goods to the rest of the world. Now, what we also see is that if you look at the factory of tomorrow, there's a few things. I mean, it's all about Industry 4.0 today. And China is definitely not behind. I mean, some factories might be behind, but if you look at the most advanced factories in China, I mean, it's all about cloud, about AI, about big data, and then they're going into what you could call digital 2.0. This is all about not just payment between customers and suppliers, but it's all about business to business connections, which actually payments are becoming automated. So you don't need any more people to pay products. Everything is happening automatically, and that's because it's going to the edge. What that means is that sensors everywhere in the world, and that's Industry 4.0 again, are being placed on every place. So whenever you ship a product, as soon as it gets onto a lorry or it gets onto a ship or from a ship or whatever you can pay part of it. And then adding that to the blockchain service network that China has built, suddenly you have the most trusted and safe environment to actually ship and get payments and pay people. And so this is a new world where machines are starting to pay instead of people. And that's just saving time, it's saving cost, it's actually going extremely fast. That is the factory of tomorrow that is already in many cases there, specifically in the south of China. And then what you also have is the Asia hub. I mean, Asia is starting to integrate, and the war in Ukraine is actually accelerating that integration. We would think differently, but it's not. The reality is that Asia, and we're talking about Asia going from all the way Japan to Saudi Arabia, I mean even Russia, because that's kind of part of it. If they're not going to be part of Asia, they're going to be on their own. And then all the way to Indonesia. I mean, it's a huge area. This is about Central Asia, about West Asia, about Southeast Asia, about North Asia. I mean, for Russia, it's still unclear what's going to happen there, but it's very clear that Asia is starting to integrate. A very good book about that is The Future is Asian, and this is from Parag Khanna, and it's a really good book to understand how that natural evolution of Asia is going about. And we're not looking at that too much because we're so much focused on what's happening in the West and specifically what's happening in Ukraine these days. China's also going into the green factory. Everything's becoming green, and that has a lot to do with the raw materials, the resources, but also the government, Beijing, that wants everything to be as green as possible because they have a huge problem as the factory of the world, emitting almost 30%, 27% of the CO2 in the world. And so they want to go completely green. And so if you see all that, I mean, China's really prepared for the factory of tomorrow. And so for me, China will become the most automated, connected, it's the most integrated and also the most sustainable factory of the world, an ecological factory of the world if we look at the future. Now, the problem with decoupling, which we want to do in the West, is that how are we going to get the resources that China has its hands on? And Russia and Ukraine and many other places. I mean, we see this as a real challenge today. And that will be specifically the raw earths and the raw materials will become the battle for tomorrow. But we're also seeing these ecosystems that have been built in China for over a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. You can't just build that in just a couple of years' time, because you need all these suppliers to work together and be connected with each other. It's not as easy as it looks. Talent is going to be a huge issue. We don't have enough engineers graduating. We don't have enough people in the West to do it. Of course, we can have them immigrate from other places in the world. I mean, China maybe has 1.4 billion people, but there's still 6-7 billion people outside of the West that could go and work for the West. So that could actually be possible. But unless we're going to change our immigration policies drastically over the next years, we're not going to attract the talent that we need. So that is going to be one of the requirements to catch up with China. And then there's inflation, there's maybe a recession, our money, we've been printing money like crazy for dealing with COVID-19, and suddenly it's not as much worth as it should be. And so we might want to invest in decoupling, but do we still have the cash to do it? That's the question. Because if we do that, maybe we're not going to be able to solve our climate goals or get our climate goals or defend ourselves against wars that are happening and so on, or get energy independence. So this is not all as easy as it looks. So from my perspective, if I look at it, for the next 10 years, I don't see China not becoming or not being or remaining the factory of the world anymore. But I do see changes happening. And the big change I see happening is that the factory of the world will become more and more the factory of Asia. What that means is that China will be replacing the West with Asia as biggest customer. I mean, this is going to go gradually because the West is still buying much more than Asia is, but we're seeing Asia every year growing, and I'm including China as well. So there's domestic demand and growth, so they're buying more internally, but also you see that Asia is growing very, very fast, and so the West, or maybe Europe, you could say, is being replaced a little bit by Asia when it comes to just the demand side. What you see in Europe is going to happen is that we will still want to buy the Chinese products, but we will preference more high quality products. The lower quality products we're going to try and decouple, or every component we need for certain machines or whatever it is, we're going to try and get them from everywhere. But the high quality products we will probably still get from China, specifically when they're green products, because that is where the economy of scale comes in. We see it already with electrical vehicles. Well, we saw it, of course, with solar panels and with wind energy, to wind turbines, but there was a lot of subsidy there. But now you see that going into everything, from refrigerators to air conditioners to, everything has sensors now, everything has to be monitored. And what that means is that China is the best place to produce these things. And because they have these economies of scale, we will be able to buy green products from China at much better prices than if we buy them from elsewhere, which means that we will have to make a decision: do we buy from China or do we hit our climate goals? And so I think we're going to go from buying from China. So we're not going to let go of China, but the type of products will be different. Internally in China, what you'll see is that they'll move up in the next 5 to 10 years in providing more high quality products, and actually the top quality products like chips to the local population. That means that the factories of the world outside China, like TSMC and Intel, but not just in chips, in every top technology that we're producing and selling to China, are now going to lose money. And so these factories will be under pressure, while China will actually grow in specifically the top technologies. When it comes to the factory of the world that we know as China, where it's really about low quality products at low prices, this will actually be done more in the emerging markets. Interesting enough, I predict that many of the Chinese companies will invest in these factories in Africa and in Central Asia and other places. And so it's going to be Chinese money, still going to be Chinese factory partially, maybe not in China, but that's still different. And China, its existing factories with existing products, cheaper products, will ship more and more to the emerging markets. And so what you see is that China's factory, in my view, will remain. But there's going to be a reshuffling of what kind of products are going to be sent to which kind of environments. And so for the next 10 years, I don't see any of these big changes. So I believe that China's factory of the world will remain even after 2030, when China is the biggest economy of the world. And then all bets are off, because that is the moment where China is bigger than America in terms of economic power, and that maybe the renminbi or the yuan will become more important in comparison to the US dollar. And so what we could see in 10 years from now is a completely different landscape. I believe the road and the path, the track towards the world from China's production will remain. The only thing is that there's going to be different tracks and different products, different destinations, and that is just a fact of life because the world is changing. But China's factory, in my view, as always, will adapt very quickly to that new world, that new reality that we will all get to know very, very soon.